to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, January 27th, 2021. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Very excited to have all of you with us, whether in our Zoom call or through one of our social channels. We stream every Wednesday, except last week, Inauguration Day, every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time. We are live on our website, on Broadband Breakfast, on our Facebook channel, our YouTube channel, and on Twitter. So you can catch us on any of those streams, or of course you can subscribe to be part of the discussion, and that way you'll have added opportunity to ask questions of our panelists and participate in the dialogue. And we certainly hope to have some great and robust dialogue here today as we get into the program. This is our fifth of six events in a series called the No Nonsense Guide to 5G. In it, we've talked about a range of topics. We've talked about rights of way. We've talked about national security and supply chain. We've talked about adoption and use in the enterprise. Today, we'll be talking about adoption and use for consumers. And in a few weeks' time, on February 10th, we'll have our final event in this series. It will be on spectrum, the radio frequencies that are necessary for 5G to be a success. And we also want to thank our sponsor, Samsung Electronics America, for sponsoring this series on a no-nonsense guide to 5G. So with that, I want to turn now to our three expert panelists. We're very excited to have all three of them with us. One of the great things about doing Broadband Breakfast Live Online is I get to talk to my friends and share that conversation with others. And these great friends, I am really pleased to welcome back. Some have been on before, Angela Seifer, but others perhaps their first time. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Sarah Oh and Dr. Trina Coleman. Sarah is a senior fellow at the Technology Policy Institute. Her bio is on the page for this event, so you can read more, but she has both a law degree and a PhD in economics, and is actually a co-author with myself, Sarah. So it's good to have you for this discussion. So Sarah, if you would mind telling us a little bit about some of the work you've done in this space of broadband adoption use, and in particular the research you've just recently concluded on the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. So let's turn it over to you for a few minutes, and then I'll introduce our other guests as we go to that. Okay.
Sure. Thank you, Drew, for having me on here and my other co-panelists. One comment that we filed just yesterday at the Federal Communications Commission talked about how the FCC can distribute $3.2 billion in the Emergency Broadband Connectivity Fund in the EBB program. So out of the appropriation from Congress to respond to COVID relief, Congress appropriated this money for broadband assistance. And in our comment, we suggest that the FCC define objectives and collect data to better understand how to narrow the digital divide through, subsidies. So I can explain further what we wrote in our comment, but a lot of my work goes into economic analysis for how to get the most bang for the buck. How can we get subsidies to lead to good outcomes, to narrow the digital divide and help people adopt more broadband?
Could you just speak extremely briefly now about this defining the objectives? Who's the appropriate entity to define the objectives? Is that for Congress, for the FCC, for someone else entirely? How would you kind of tackle that question?
Sure. So in the statute from Congress, there wasn't a defined objective. It'd be nice if Congress spoke on that topic, but the FCC has delegated authority and a lot of experience on universal service. So in its public notice, the FCC is asking for feedback on how it should set up the EBB. And so we recommend that the FCC in the order define objectives and lay out a plan for data collection and analysis. So the FCC has the expertise and authority, I think, to define their objectives. And we offer some suggestions, such as minimizing the number of households who lose broadband service due to financial distress caused by the pandemic. Another objective could be increase adoption among households that aren't currently connected. So those are two kind of different objectives. Help households not lose their existing subscription, or help households get online who aren't currently connected. And then it could be some combination of those two objectives. So depending on like what the FCC is seeking to do with the money, will result in different outcomes.
Just to recap for everyone that point, namely that what sort of, as you just suggested, a hypothetical is to either define it as making sure people don't lose access to broadband, or that we increase the number of people who get online that aren't online. That's kind of the way you frame that choice, right? Right, Sarah?
Yes, and we also suggest that maybe the FCC should consider whether the money should be used to upgrade service. We don't quite think so. I mean, maybe subscribers want to use the money. Eligible subscribers might seek to use the subsidy to like increase their levels of service, but in a policy trade-off, do you want those dollars to go to that purpose, or do you want the dollars to go to households that aren't currently connected to just get connected? So there are some trade-offs.
Well, great. Thanks for that summary. We'll come back to more of your work generally and how it ties into adoption, use, and as well as sort of this question of newer technologies and the deployment and how we get those, or should it really be an objective to get them adopted and used, so to speak. But let's go ahead and turn now to Dr. Trina L. Coleman, who's a thought leader on STEM subjects, and I know her principally through her role with the U.S. Distance Learning Association. Love for you and your comments, Trina, to speak a little bit about USDLA and some of the things you're doing. But what are your thoughts on this question of how we can ensure greater adoption use of broadband generally, and also 5G, if you have some perspectives on that? So, Dr. Coleman, what are your thoughts here?
Well, thank you, Drew, for having me on Broadband Breakfast. I have several thoughts, as you know. We've had conversations, but adoption is something that is a tricky subject. I recently participated on the Broadband Research Workshop initiative with NSF and NTIA, and that was one of the things that me and my colleagues from around the globe had many discussions about. Adoption is a socioeconomic problem, first and foremost, because, for example, the omnibus package had money built into it for broadband, and some of it was to help lower income or underrepresented or whatever households you want to call them who can't afford to pay the fee for broadband have a stipend, a monthly stipend of sorts. People tend to kind of get wary of a free gift from the government. So, they may think, oh, they want our data, or they want to know what we're doing and things like that. And also the age demographic varies with respect to adoption. Older, I'll say seasoned individuals may not feel like they need to have broadband so much or understand it. They just want to have a mobile phone, maybe with a hinge on it. I call them flips. But anyway, the 5G conundrum with respect to those without is the sticking point with corporate America. It's political, it's economic, it's academic. And one of the things, as you know, that I am passionate about is focusing on the Minority Broadband Initiative with the NTIA, and also USDLA is, we have our policy committee that is focused also on the disparities that exist within the broadband environment. One more thing I'd like to say about that is the National Broadband Availability Map, which is a thing that is being also overseen by the NTIA, only has 22 states, I believe, that are participating right now. And that is to collect data, GIS information about where broadband is available and where it isn't, and to map that information across the country. So I think that it's kind of disturbing that everybody's not participating in that endeavor. So bridging gaps in access is something that we need to do sooner than later. As stated earlier, the pandemic has illuminated those problems with 1,000-watt bulb. We have issues. They're big. They're making larger gaps academically for students that already had disadvantages. And so that's my 2 cents right now, but we'll come back to a whole lot of what I just said and try to compress it.
Yeah, let me ask you to kind of address the frame that Sarah put on the issue for the FCC to decide, and how you would view this as a conversation point. That is to say, should an immediate goal be making sure people who have had connectivity but have been disconnected by the pandemic have funding to get connected again? Or should there be an important push approach to making sure everyone who isn't already connected can be connected? Do you have thoughts on that question?
I do. And I think that those who are not connected should be connected. Right now and forevermore, broadband is a utility. It's not a luxury item anymore. It's a necessity. One of the things that I also think should happen per government, FCC, etc., is to address the disparity for what it is. It started with the redlining of neighborhoods. The country is redlined. Infrastructure is not equal from one census tract to the next census tract. So until that disparity is reconciled, then will access be equally distributed or more equally distributed. So I think that, yes, the FCC and the Form 477 and how that data is collected and what they're looking at to say, okay, this census tract is connected because this house on the edge might have broadband, but the rest of them don't. But the entire area is considered an area that has availability.
We'll continue to get into this topic of disparities and lack of equal treatment, and even to use the redlining word that is used, and I'd love your thoughts as we continue to discuss this. And I guess with that, I kind of want to turn it over to Angela and your incredible work at National Digital Inclusion Alliance, or maybe there's another word in there, and National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Tell us a little bit about NDIA and how you look at this issue of making sure everyone is able to get online with highest capacity broadband possible. Angela, there you go, unmute, thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Drew, for having me. NDIA is a national organization. We represent community-based organizations, libraries, housing authorities, local governments, anyone locally that is doing the work of digital inclusion. And by that, we mean organizations that are helping folks get signed up for discount internet, maybe creating some lower priced internet options, finding access to devices, whether that's buying them or refurbishing them, providing digital literacy training, providing tech support in order to just be able to function online. And so we represent the folks doing that work. So that's our uniqueness out there, is that, and we got started because federal policy was being made and policymakers had no idea that folks on the ground were actually doing this work. So we do both the peer-to-peer networking, so the folks doing the work can share best practices and lessons learned with each other. And then we learn from them and we use what we learn to influence public policy. Regarding adoption, We are very clear about the fact that yes, access to infrastructure in rural areas is a serious, significant issue that needs to be dealt with, but we can't focus all of our attention federally on the rural availability and miss out on the fact that there are 26 million households in the US that don't adopt broadband in urban areas. 36 million households total. So there are more households in urban areas that aren't adopting than in rural areas. So we know that's less about the availability. That's more about affordability and digital literacy. And so we have to be able to get at those issues together and at the same time. The piece where 5G comes into this is that we at NDIA worry that 5G is actually going to cause a new digital divide if we don't catch it before it happens, right? As Dr. Coleman noted, digital redlining is real. It happens, right? There are areas of the country where internet service providers have not provided service in a low-income neighborhood because they don't think they're going to get the return that they would get in a higher income neighborhood. I'm not casting aspersions. I'm just stating a fact, right? Internet service providers, it's a commodity. It's a business. They want the highest return. So we as a community, as a country need to decide, okay, are we not okay with that? If we're not okay with that, then what is our solution? Are we going to tell the internet service providers they need to provide service in a lower income neighborhood? So 5G, are we going to say needs to be rolled out everywhere? Or do we find a different solution for the places where they don't intend to go?
So as you were talking, I was posing a question that I want to ask you, which is to say, are the economics of redlining in the wire-based world, that is to say, as you outlined kind of in summary form, if it's not cost effective, you're going to see providers focus on more on neighborhoods they think are going to be greater take rates for their wire, their fiber builds, right? Are the economics of that on the wire base the same or different as you're seeing it, Angela, from the economics of 5G deployment, or do we really have a new opportunity, a new leaf, so to speak, to get higher capacity through 5G that isn't determined by those economics of wire-based broadband?
So I think it's about intention. If we think 5G is going to be something that really transforms how we all interact online, then we need to intentionally be inclusive with that technology. And that not only means that the infrastructure is there, but do folks have the right device? Because the device you have right now isn't going to cut it. So how do we make sure people do in fact have the right device? One of the suggestions in Verizon just last week announced their recommendations to the federal government for addressing broadband adoption. And one of those was a device subsidy every 2 years. And I think that's the kind of proactive thinking that we're going to need if we're to be ready for the new digital divides that are going to show up, like 5G, so that we can get in front of it instead of afterwards we're like, oh gee, surprise, we have a new digital divide because 5G. Well, certainly we do. We all knew that was going to happen. So can we get in front of that and try to avoid it being too terrible, or do we just let it happen?
No, that's fascinating to raise that issue of a subsidy, right? Because we are used to thinking in this sense of subsidy for recurring telecommunications expenditures. Indeed, that's what the USF, the Universal Service Fund, both in its high cost and in its Lifeline approach is about. It's about a recurring subsidy. Different entities are subsidized, right? In the high cost, it's the provider that's subsidized, whereas in the Lifeline, it's the individual that's subsidized. But you're kind of raising it's almost like a CapEx, right? I mean, like we can think about a capital expenditure from a stimulus that supports broadband. We could also think of a capital expenditure, not as long a capital, because a phone does not last as long as a fiber network, but that's an interesting way of thinking about it. And actually, let me kind of turn to Sarah for a moment to talk about this whole point about recurring expenditures and how you see the appropriate kind of way the Universal Service Fund should manage recurring versus non-recurring expenditures.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a good question about subsidies. One point that we make in our comment is to be cautious about income transfers. So depending on how the FCC shapes this program, the EBB or USF, it could be just a lot of transfer of revenue to ISPs. If the money is going to households that would subscribe anyway, the vouchers are pretty much just moving money from one location to another, and without really thinking about the households that are benefiting. And so that's one point to think about for subsidies. But I also just wanted to, raise the difficult question, like, how do you define trade-offs between 5G, like wireless handsets, and like wired household adoption? So, let's say that there is just one pot of money, and it could be a very large pot of money, like 3 billion, 10 billion a year. Are there policy principles? Like, do we have a sense of prioritization? Is it more important to get 26 million households online, or get everyone on 5G? I think that's an important like question to think about. Not just like, oh, everybody should get everything, but if there's an order, I would think that it's probably to get the unconnected online. But I'm curious to hear if you have thoughts on that.
Can I respond, Drew?
Please.
Because I think, Sarah, I think that's exactly right, is that we all have to have those discussions and figure out where our priority is. And I think a lot of it has to do with us understanding where the future lies, and at the same time, what the reality is right now. Because we need both those short-term solutions, and then we also need the long-term solutions. A good example is the hotspots that libraries distribute. Yes, that's a good idea. Or even more extreme, a bus that has Wi-Fi that is sitting out in a parking lot, right? Because there's no other Wi-Fi in that area. That's a short-term solution, and we should not think that that's a long-term solution. And thinking about the continuum of that's at the extreme of, okay, this is short term, let's move into some longer term solutions. And then along that continuum would be addressing people's needs right now with something that's more substantial, like a wired connection into their home. But at the same time that we're doing this, and this is where it gets really tricky, planning for the future, do we really think that 5G is going to be that kind of, or whatever the next technology is, right? Keeping track of it, whatever the next connection solution is, that we're ready for that, so we don't end up with a whole bunch of folks who are still participating in the old internet and not participating in the new internet, and then applications move to the new one and then they can't participate because they don't have, or for like the space we're in right now, folks that have really slow connections, they kind of participate, they kind of don't, because it doesn't really work for them the way it works for other people.
May I jump in, Drew?
Yeah, jump in.
All right, I'm jumping in. Okay, this is the part where I get to say that this conversation that is had daily by many basically boils down to this. The haves are trying to determine what the have-nots get. And that's what makes this thing go so cyclic. It's like, okay, well, do they need that much? Well, we decide who gets what because we have it. And the haves are the providers, the funders, and the people like us. And I'm not kicking anybody's shin, but we aren't in the situation that the people that need these services are in. We don't have to wait for a bus to show up and go and drive or ride or walk down to where the bus is to get internet to do homework. And a lot of students are doing that right now. So understanding what the challenges are, we get them from a high level, but everybody's situation is not homogeneous. The determining, or the least common denominator is lack of access. Lack of access may be because of XYZ. There is no access. There may be affordability, but no access. There'll be access but no affordability. There may be some in the middle part where you have to choose, okay, we have enough money to either get more internet bandwidth or to make sure that we can continue to have 3 meals a day instead of 2. I mean, those are the real trade-offs that people have in these types of situations, particularly now. The gap is getting larger, as Angela stated, before we even get to the point where 5G is a real deal that we will have to consider nationally. Right now, we have the broadening gap. People are not able to connect because they have to make choices. And so it's almost as if internet, we have 3 conundrums in this country, and this is a whole nother show, Drew. Internet, healthcare, and education. We decide who gets enough of each of those. The haves do. The have-nots get what they get.
So thank you for that perspective, and I want to kind of continue to wrap my mind around how we sort of move that forward. We're getting a lot of really great questions from our audience here on Zoom right now, and I want to try to build on one of them from Matthew Snyder. He says subsidies need to be long-lasting, permanent, and easily obtainable for underserved communities. Long-lasting, permanent. All right, we'll still. I see you jumped in there. Do you want to elaborate on that, Matthew? Since you dived in here.
Yeah. So one of the, when we look at Comcast Essentials, for example, there's a number of requisites in there that are not met by individuals and that make it very, very difficult to obtain the low-cost broadband that's actually fairly inadequate as it is. And so one of the things that's really concerning about it is when we ask those organizations how many people are actually able to take advantage of those subsidies and those programs that you have, they don't provide that data because they consider it proprietary information. So we have no way of knowing how effective those programs are. And the new programs that are coming in from the CARES Act money, this $50 subsidy, is only going to be there as a result of COVID. When COVID goes away, what are the subsidies that are going to be there to continue helping these individuals and communities have access to that kind of broadband? In the policies that we're recommending from Century Tech, we are advocating for longstanding and permanent subsidies so that we can make sure that people have access.
So let's go ahead and get our panel's reaction to that. We'll kind of pop you out there, Matt. And I was going to build as well, but he's done quite a good job of this point about long-lasting versus short-lasting, the COVID point, but also the easily obtainable. So Dr. O and Dr. Coleman and Angela as well, could you speak to this question? How much of a detriment is how hard or difficult it is, hard or easy it is to get access to subsidies?
May I go first?
Please.
Okay. The long lasting, hi Matthew, by the way, is a good thing for as long as you need it. What I see from that is it will appear to be some level of dependency, because ultimately you should be able to move upward. Upward mobility should come about if you have equal tools to play with as other people. So the long lasting should be long enough to get to where you don't need that subsidy anymore, as opposed to it being built into your budget. Okay, I'm getting this much money for internet every month for the rest of my life. No, that's not the objective. Nobody wants that, but they do need it for as long as they need it, which is going to vary from one person to the other.
Drew,
Thank you.
Could go next. We need to make sure that this emergency broadband benefit is a success. We need to make sure that we use the money, we get it out to the people that need it, and we need to make sure we're learning lessons so that when we then set up a permanent broadband benefit, as many of us think we should do, that we know how to do it more correctly, because we're essentially getting a test run right now as to how to do it. Those of us in the public interest field that have worked on the discount programs already, right? Like that's what our affiliates do, is help folks sign up for those discount programs, know that it's a challenge sometimes getting folks to sign up. And COVID taught lots of folks that. They taught school districts and cities who went out and bought, bulk purchased accounts and then had folks not sign up for them. The pilots at the FCC showed us that when an internet service provider offers you free internet, don't always take it. So we need to understand how to get folks to sign up. I read Lloyd Levine's article that he published in April 2020. Drew, if you haven't had Lloyd on, I encouraged him as a guest. It's a really good academic paper around broadband adoption. They look at specific different ways that you can encourage someone to sign up for internet that's being paid for by somebody else, so free to you. And the way that works the best is when there is a trusted institution on the other side of the phone guiding you through the whole process, not handing you off to an ISP and expecting them to just take it from there. But then also asking you about the other barriers you may have. Do you have a device? Because it's not just about having that internet connection. Do you have the tech support do you need? Do you need digital literacy training? And so when you have somebody who leads you through that from beginning to end, not multiple conversations, but pretty much all in one conversation, maybe with one follow-up, the results are really stark compared to just, like sending an email or putting a poster on the bus stop.
And I'll respond to, I think, I appreciated the point about how we don't have data on where the subsidies are being spent. And so in our comment, we say that the FCC can require providers from the EBB program to report back anonymized data on who subscribed to the subsidy so that we could actually know more about adoption issues. Lifeline providers are already required to keep documentation on their subscribers, but they don't submit it to the FCC because I guess the FCC doesn't ask for it. And it's very possible that Lifeline providers could send anonymized statistics on their subscribers, like age or zip code. And that kind of data would be really good for researchers like myself, so that we could better understand who's actually adopting the Lifeline program, who's adopting the handsets in the EBB program or the laptops. So one thing the FCC can do is to do a better job collecting data at a very granular level. And it can be anonymized, so there aren't data privacy concerns. And just imagine what kind of national database that would be. It would be really, really good for digital divide studies, and it would protect privacy, and it would help us to target future subsidies better. There is actually very little empirical knowledge about Lifeline. We don't know who is buying the phones. Is it benefiting older people or younger people? What kind of phones? Where? How? What level of service? So yeah. And then my other research is on E-rate, and so the E-rate program in USF, the schools and libraries submit public data on what they're paying for, what connections they have, and so one thing that we're doing at my institute, Technology Policy Institute, is we're creating web tools so that it's easier to see for the public to see how much is being spent at this school, or what are the connectivity rates in congressional districts or in rural areas versus urban. So there's a lot that can happen with better data.
And that's something that I and that Executive Director Scott Walston of TPI have worked a lot on over the years. And indeed, we kind of started after the quest for better broadband data, broadband census, right? And we're getting so many great questions. And if the panelists want to sort of chime in on some of them as you answer, please do. One that's just come in from Dave Guilford says, how do we ensure that subsidy programs encourage service expansion, new entrants, and customer choice? And it kind of ties back to this thing I've partway articulated, but want to kind of directly, which is to say, what do we know about whether subsidy programs are better targeted at devices or capital versus recurring, right? What do we know as well? You can almost do a little matrix of CapEx, OpEx, and individuals versus, providers, right? Because I imagine there's research, Sarah, that you've done and others done, or perhaps Angela, you at NDIA have looked at this question. So specifically around David's question, how do we ensure that subsidy programs encourage customer choice, right? Encourage, new entrants. Do any of the three of you have any thoughts on that question that David's asked?
I would.
I can speak to the piece of it that has to do the subsidies to households, and I'll let my colleagues speak to the subsidies towards the companies themselves. So for the subsidies towards households, we do need to make sure that there is as much opportunity there as we can. With Lifeline, the providers need to be an ETC. With this emergency broadband benefit, ETCs are automatically like in the fast lane, and then everybody else gets put in a different lane because their products and how they would gather the data needs to still be understood. So I think when we modernized Lifeline, at that point there was discussion, and in the rules we had language around a national broadband, a national Lifeline provider that could be a non-ETC. The most recent FCC did not, they cut that back. But I think we need to go back to that. And it's exactly for the point that Randy's bringing up. We don't have enough options out there for low-income households to have an option that's affordable to them. So we need to make sure everybody is brought in and who is a potential solution to this. I find it really fascinating that during this pandemic, we've seen a variety of networks being built to address affordability, rather than what we had seen prior to the pandemic, which is networks being built to address availability. So we're seeing school districts build their own LTE networks, right? We're seeing city governments use their own fiber and open it up to other broadband providers in order to then have more options that are specifically targeting that service to low-income neighborhoods, not to the whole community. So I find this phenomena that's happening organically, right? This wasn't being pushed by anyone nationally. It's just happening locally, where folks are saying we have to address affordability, and we don't have the providers at this moment in our community that can help us do that. So we're going to build a new solution.
Okay.
Rena, go ahead.
Yes. I think that one of the challenges is the fact that when something is offered to low income, underrepresented communities, such as a subsidy, for example, for broadband, there tends to be a whole lot of deep dive into that household's income records. What do you have? If you have too much of this, or if you have $25 in a savings account, then you don't qualify. So getting to the point where people don't have to be a step away from homelessness in order to qualify for these subsidies is something that needs to be looked at, because that's kind of the way systems tend to be set up in the country historically. For example, Medicaid. You have to sell your house almost. If you have, you can't have any assets in order to qualify for these types of programs. So looking at how it's structured, how much deep dive into your information they want to do to give you $50 a month is something that will help encourage people to subscribe and to participate in these types of programs.
What is the evidence from your knowledge, Sarah, show about this question of is the cost of providing the information worth it, so to speak, right? I mean, do we means testing, right, or versus not means testing, just making it available for free?
Well, at least in my understanding of Lifeline, the big reform was the National Verifier database. And then now there's more talk about incorporating SNAP benefit level, like reconciliation of the two databases. So if you're in SNAP, then it would be a lot easier or faster to get Lifeline. I think there's talk about that. And the reason why it's hard to verify income is, the reason why it's important to verify income is because Lifeline has a long history of like fraud, waste, and abuse by vendors. So, and the reason why, there's all this auditing of the eligible providers is because there was a lot of funny business and like old rosters of subscribers, like people who duplicates or like people who had passed away. And it's costly and time consuming to keep like updated lists of subscribers, and costly for the FCC to enforce that rule and to monitor the providers. So I think it's really good to have some standard database for income eligibility. And then I hear like the other comments, like make the eligibility requirements easier. And that's something, I don't know like what the mechanism is to make SNAP benefits broader or, a database larger. But that's what I know about Lifeline.
Go ahead, Dr. Coleman.
Yeah, I was just going to say that one of the things there are a lot of things that are available, and that's why I open with my comments about those that are not in the situation need to understand what the situation is. Subsidized housing, for example, those standards have already been met. If you live in subsidized housing, you've already filled out all the requirements, Section 8 housing, those types of things. You're already qualified to receive those types of benefits. You shouldn't have to re-qualify to get the subsidy if you're already in that level. If you're receiving Medicaid benefits, you're already qualified. You shouldn't have to go through that process again. That information is readily available if given to the providers, or if work, with the providers and those entities that house that type of data. But the FCC has allowed providers to hold their information close to the vest. And I don't know where we can make those two entities or those several entities merge.
Stu Johnson asked the question, don't allow force providers to verify and monitor eligibility. I'd be interested in Angela's reaction to that, and this question generally.
So there's two different things. There's the emergency broadband benefit, and then that's how we think about a permanent broadband benefit. So in the emergency broadband benefit, they wanted that in there and they got that. So they can play that role. The idea was to make the emergency broadband benefit is voluntary for the providers. And so the idea was to make it as welcoming to them as the federal government could, because they could choose like, look, too much work, we're just not going to do it. So we want to make sure that they could participate. Those that already have a discount offer can use the processes that they've already set up. Those that don't already have a discount offer may choose to then use the Lifeline's national verifier process, or whatever it is the FCC or USAC comes up with that most likely makes use of that national verifier. I do think there's a balance in there that I understand where Stu's coming from, that it could be onerous on the providers, and it could also be something that, as Sarah mentioned, that we did have waste, fraud, abuse, and we don't want to end up in another situation like that. So I think those two issues need to be considered. Also with the availability, the eligibility issues, at least in the emergency broadband benefit, it was laid out by Congress. So that part is great, because then we don't have to have that argument, and it's really broad, and it is Lifeline eligibility. So yes, if you're already on that Lifeline eligibility, which includes HUD, and it includes SNAP, and it includes veterans, and it's a good broad list. What we will learn is whether or not that works for then when we want to then try to build a permanent broadband benefit. The part that's a lot trickier is the eligibility in the legislation about those who have lost income. I have no idea how the FCC and USAC are going to figure out what kind of documentation one would submit for that. So, it's one of those like, God bless you, that's your problem and to figure out.
Well, there's another question. Again, great questions keep coming in. One asked a little bit ago. I think it's worth asking and considering. Michael Elling, says that 4G was supply following demand. The latter was defined as the app ecosystems, and I see he's jumped on here, and grew out of the introduction of the iPhone and Android, and carriers maintained high prices relative to Wi-Fi. Now, Michael, are you arguing that the demand is not there for 5G, or do you have a view that it could be there if there were, for example, device subsidies? What are your thoughts on this? Feel free to elaborate a little bit more.
I would say yes. I don't believe there will be demand, and no, I don't believe that subsidies would necessarily help. And the logic goes something like this: we had several generations of technology, 1, 2, 3G. And if you go back pre-iPhone and you remember how 3G was getting built out and what the demand drivers were there, we had gone from 0% penetration in about 15 years to, almost 100% penetration by 2006, 2007. And so the key thing about 4G, what people fail to realize, is that when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone, he introduced it in a way that his operating system didn't need permission from the carriers to get to Wi-Fi. So that created the ubiquity, if you will, of the application performance, and why people got used to using it both on 3G and in their homes on Wi-Fi. Now, we found 3G to be inadequate, and as the app ecosystem grew and the smartphone penetration grew in 2008, 9, and 10, we suddenly saw this enormous demand pull through for 4G coverage, right? We all lived through it, so we know what I'm talking about. This is not new, but people don't focus on that. We don't have the same process, if you will, developing with 5G. That's my point.
Okay, well, I think it's a fair point, and let's invite our panelists' reactions to that. I have a couple thoughts too, but let's hear from Angela and Sarah and Trina first, and we'll go ahead and turn you off, Michael, okay? Anyone want to react to that?
You start us off, Drew.
I'll start off. So I think that it is true. I mean, and we've made this observation at the start when we plotted out this series that it does seem as though it's the enterprises that are moving forward faster on 5G. We're finally beginning to see a lot more mass market use from a retail consumer standpoint. But I think there's still a question of what do I get with 5G that I don't get with something else. That's a question that people have to ask. And I think it's part of it is searching for the application. So, the panel description for this discussion does talk about what are some of the drivers for 5G equipment and services. Are we seeing them, right? Or are we, or is it just, a solution looking for a problem? Granted, we will get to that solution, but how quickly is it necessary that we do that? And that's kind of really the question I'd invite your reactions to, because we do want to address and make sure that we're not just building out broadband, cool broadband apps for a very niche section of the population. We want to make sure that there's universality. That is the key promise, or at least it should be the key promise of broadband for all. So anyway, I've gotten on my soapbox now. So I'd love to hear from you to this question or some of these other questions we're having.
Back to academics, Drew. I think that the largest audience that 5G is probably attractive to will be higher ed, education, using all the AI and the VR and all of those types of applications are driving this 5G revolution. And right now, the average citizen doesn't necessarily care as long as their phone works and they can use TikTok, basically. So I think 5G is more of a academic / government system, corporate type push.
Well, yeah, you're ending on a different note. When you started, I thought you were saying that it's really going to be, use cases of universities, right, are among those that are going to take advantage of that need. Right.
Which will move it towards those other types of entities. Universities are, esports, for example. That's a big thing right now. And setting up esports programs, setting up cybersecurity programs in a higher ed space, and those types of next generation technologies, so to speak, will be taking advantage of these 5G. And as you know, one of the things that I focus on, as does USDLA, is making sure that access is available to the networks that are needed in order to move education forward.
Yeah, and that's kind of, it's almost a paradigm for the way, that's how we got broadband, right? In the first case is like universities. It was 4 universities, you know, Stanford, University of Utah, and UCLA and MIT that connected on the DARPA, you know, the ARPANET. And so we kind of have seen that process of universities playing a role. And so I think it's great to kind of come back to that. But again, we want to make sure we're not leaving people behind. And that's kind of what our panelists have some expertise on. And I definitely want to hear what Angela and Sarah have to say about this 5G question in particular, right? So Angela, earlier on, you referred to your concern that there's a new 5G divide coming, right? What are the causes for that concern? Where do you see that emerging?
The cause for the concern is that we already know that as newer technologies have been rolled out, sometimes low-income neighborhoods get skipped. So there's no reason to think that with the next newer technologies, maybe it's 5G, and as comments in the chat, maybe it's 6G, whatever it is, whatever our new solutions are, that if we are not intentional, we will skip neighborhoods, right? We'll skip them in rural areas, we'll skip them in poor urban areas. And if we are all aware of that, we can be more intentional to not just allow it to happen. But then I think the tricky part becomes, so what's the answer then? Are we going to force those providers to put it in those neighborhoods? Maybe do we incentivize them to put it in those neighborhoods? Do we look for alternative providers for those neighborhoods, right? So there's a different variety of ways to do it. Up until COVID, we just didn't have the awareness that we have now. And that awareness means there are more local solutions being figured out, and frankly, push back against some of the incumbents who would say, we're going to get to that later.
Right.
Or the best answer really, Drew, was, don't worry, 5G is coming. I can't tell you how many times I've been told that and how many times it makes me scream, because the problem is now and it needs to be solved now. No, I don't think 5G is going to be like the ultimate solution as I've been told.
Well, so Angela, what I hear when you say that word intentional is universal broadband, right? We can't accept not having the capability of getting universal broadband everywhere, or at least 99 point, you know, whatever. There may be some parts of very deeply rural areas that we have to kind of like from a cost benefit perspective, but in terms of the universality of it, right? This is where you can definitely see a role for funding for infrastructure as opposed to recurring operations to build out or to provide, you know, because again, with 5G, we're going to have a lot more towers in more locations, not necessarily the big macro towers, but small cells. And this was one of our discussions in December. We talked about the rights of way issue and how we're going to need these more. And whether we're talking about getting everyone access to be able to get to a fiber connection or to a 5G super fast wireless connection, in some ways you're really dealing with the same set of issues as getting fiber deeper into the neighborhoods and everywhere, not just select places.
It is, but at the same time, Drew, we can't ignore the adoption issue. So that there may be infrastructure already in some places and folks aren't adopting it. And we can't say, well, we're only going to work on the availability of these infrastructures first, and then we'll deal with the adoption issue later. It has to be dealt with at the same time. So as we look down the road at those newer technologies, what are the pieces of them we need to understand? Like if we think 5G is really going to be the thing that's going to change how we use the internet, we need to recognize that you need a different device. At this current moment in time, you can't use the same device you have now to get on that 5G network. That's an additional cost. Is there a learning curve? I honestly don't know. I don't have a 5G device or a 5G network, right? Like, so we need to know what are those different barriers so we can prepare for them.
Thanks. Sarah or Trina, do you want to weigh in on this point here?
You have something you want to add, Sarah?
I mean, yeah, this is like the conversation about the digital divide, affordability versus availability. And I do appreciate like the point that for low-income Americans, like, yeah, the government doesn't know each individual person's trade-offs. Like, you know, $50 could be spent in many different ways. I don't know if, you know, a preference would be for home broadband over a 5G phone, or, you know, the easy answer is just, well, pay for it all. But like, we have to be able to have some idea of like policy preferences. Like, is it more important to get a wired connection to the 26 million households to get them online, or is it important to facilitate upgrades to the newest technology? I mean, it's always trade-offs, but that's something that the FCC can actually study and can know, and economists like myself can know better what those trade-offs are. Like $1 spent on rural broadband versus $1 spent on wireless subsidies. You know, how should the Universal Service Fund make those decisions? And that is for the FCC to decide in how to manage the program. So I wish we had more data, and that's kind of the big thing. Like, we need to track these things and see who's benefiting and who's left out.
Well, maybe to kind of coordinate some questions and some thoughts that I think are still out there into a final question or thought for each of you is this question of, again, it's been asked here about funding infrastructure versus funding monthly subsidies. But let's throw another mix in here, which is support for programs that are going to address digital inclusion issues, right? And so, like, for example, when the last broadband stimulus was proposed, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, there was funding for infrastructure, there was funding for digital inclusion, adoption and use, and there was also funding for planning, right? For you know, mapping, right? And that was on top of the recurring USF funding for sort of monthly subsidies. So just throwing all those out there, infrastructure, training, recurring monthly, or even planning, if you will. What do we need to spend money on? Because that's where we seem to be going in Washington, is to spend money on this problem. What are the right levers to use to get at the problem of lack of broadband adoption and use? And let's just take everyone's thoughts on this as closing remarks. Let's start with you, Angela, and then Sarah, and then we'll close with you, Dr. Trina Coleman.
So I know we have limited amounts of funds to do all of these things, but we are going to have to prioritize getting at all of the barriers to broadband adoption and figuring out how much money goes into each pot. And inside that, Drew, is the planning piece of it. So this idea that we need state level digital equity plans, we need a national digital equity plan. We don't have these things for the most part. The contents of the Digital Equity Act have been put in multiple bills that passed in the House and didn't make it through the Senate. We have high hopes that could happen in this year because we do need to know what the resources are in a community. So a state, I really think this whole virtual learning business and all of us being at home during the pandemic would have looked different if we'd had that money for the states to do digital equity planning, which they didn't.
Sarah, Dr. O.
Yeah, I'll just emphasize again the importance of data and how policymakers and researchers just need to be able to track where the subsidies have gone, where they're going, are they effective, and then using that data to be able to improve programs.
We got to learn. We got to learn from what we're doing, and whenever it is. And I mean, I don't want to be one to not point out that I think the Universal Service Fund has learned over the past 10 years from, in terms of the distribution, not necessarily to the issue we've talked about here today, but in terms of subsidies and reverse auctions. I think that's a definite progress of learning that's happened. So wanted to just put a cap on that one. Dr. Coleman, what are some of your final thoughts for close us out here?
All right. Well, this has been a very engaging panel, first of all, I'd like to say. Outcomes are important. We've had several programs that have had multiple millions and maybe billions of dollars thrown at them to talk about, try to fix some of this stuff. And we need to see some concrete outcomes. Also, there has to be a level of accountability. As was stated, there was fraud and misuse of funds because, once again, those entrusted with said funds were not completely on board with what the funds were for. They saw it as a profit for their service, but also, they were supposed to provide said service for said profit. Also, the American Community Surveys done by the U.S. Census Bureau showed that the digital divide as of 2017 had 36% of African American households did not have any connectivity or device in the home. So that's over a third of our country. And it also is a disproportionate amount of African American students' homes that don't have services. So I think that also plays into this shell game of, okay, we can do some stuff, we can't do some stuff. Urban areas, maybe some of that, all of that is part of this whole socioeconomic dynamic, which needs to be reconciled in order to move this thing at least an inch forward.
Well, with that, I want to move towards thanking our panel, but remind you that next week we will be addressing one of our other topics. It'll be tools for broadband deployment, and we'll be talking about the issues of mapping for the rural broadband build-out. Don't miss that, February 3rd at 12 noon Eastern time. And before we bid you adieu or au revoir, we want to thank our three panelists, Dr. Trina Coleman, Dr. Sarah Oh, and Angela Seifer, who's Executive Director of National Digital Inclusion Alliance. On behalf of each of them, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. We will see you